Launchpad. And now, here's Johnny.
Hey, it's Johnny Rocket here at the Johnny Rocket Launchpad, launching ideas in your direction. The Northwest only rock and roll libertarian radio show. I'm here with it is rock and roll. It is rock and roll. Well, I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Kurt Nelson.
Yes, sir.
The voice of reason, the beautiful Heather Nixon.
Hello.
And we are here with Professor Kevin Gutzman. Woo! Yeah!
Thanks again for being with us, Mr. Gutzman.
Professor, it's awesome. And again, New York Times bestselling author, 4 books, professor of history at Western Connecticut State University. Check out his website at kevingutzman.com, KEVINGUTZMAN.com. He has some awesome stuff on there. And we're going to put your books up on our website at thejohnnyrocketlaunchpad.com. Before we move on, we have a thing we do on our third segment. And it's called Rocket Fire.
Yes, sir. It's my favorite.
It's Kurt's favorite. And in Rocket Fire, basically, I'm going to ask you 10 questions. And out of these 10 questions, I'll give you, 30 to 60 seconds to answer these questions to the best of your ability. Keep it short and sweet. You ready to play Rocket Fire?
Yes.
Question 1. Are the federal regulations by agencies and bureaucracies constitutional?
No.
Bam. Yeah.
You want to go into that a little bit?
Well, the Constitution gives legislative authority to Congress. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative authority will be in a Congress of the United States. So since administrative agencies are not Congress, they have no constitutional authority to enact laws, which is what they do.
Right on. Question 2. Is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, constitutional?
Well, I guess that depends on the extent, or I guess that depends on what it's trying to regulate. So, for example, if the issue is involving the coastal waterways, then the United States government arguably has some authority there, but certainly most of what the EPA does is unconstitutional. And as to the part that is perhaps not entirely internal to a particular state, much of that is unconstitutional too. So, but the thing is, when they created the Environmental Protection Agency, nobody even asked this question, because we're already in the culture I described earlier, in which it's just taken for granted by people in Washington that they can do whatever they want.
Right on. I'm with you. Is having a space program constitutional?
No, unless it's military. So essentially all of NASA that's not military is unconstitutional.
Right on.
Now, of course, we don't know how much of NASA is military.
Right. You never know.
True too. Yeah.
We don't know.
I have to think that when they were sending that completely foolish space shuttle up to the space station over and over, they weren't just flying up there and flying back. They must have been doing something military. That's my guess. But in general, NASA's unconstitutional, sure. And of course, it's entirely wasteful while they're at it.
Right on. Question 4. Is having an Army base constitutional?
An Army base? Sure.
Yeah. And when I expand on that, because there's an argument that we can't have a standing army portion of it.
Yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that bans having a standing army. People had the idea of banning standing armies at the time that the Constitution was written, and the only thing that came out of that in the Philadelphia Convention was a requirement that mandate that no military appropriation be for longer than 2 years. So Congress has to come back and reauthorize particular military functions every 2 years, but there's not a ban on having a standing army.
Right on. 5. Was the Eisenhower interstate system constitutional?
No.
Okay.
Actually, anybody who's interested in this question could check out the part of my book, James Madison and the Making of America, about the bonus bill veto message. The very last thing that James Madison did on his last day as president was to veto what was called the bonus bill, which was a bill that Congress intended to use or intended for the purpose of deciding what it would spend its share of the profits from the Bank of the United States on. So the federal government was going to be a part owner of the unconstitutional Second Bank of the United States. It was going to get profit from that. What would it do with it? Well, Congress's idea was it would spend this money on a national network of roads, canals, and bridges. And in his very last act as president, President James Madison, chief author of the Constitution, said this is unconstitutional. Nothing in the Constitution says that Congress can spend money on roads, canals, and bridges. I told you if you're going to pass this kind of law, you needed to amend the Constitution first to give yourselves authority to do this. You didn't do that, and so veto.
Right
and
on.
nothing has changed since, in my opinion. There's actually a chapter on the general subject of the Eisenhower program in Tom Woods in my book, Who Killed the Constitution? And we examine Madison's bonus bill veto message and, again, the complete lack of interest in the Constitution on the part of the people who created this current Eisenhower system. The other thing to notice about the Eisenhower interstate highway system is it is so completely wasteful. It's just beyond belief. I mean, I could bore you for an hour with stories of completely wasteful spending on the interstate highways that would never have happened if they were being funded by the state governments. But since it's the federal government, well, we'll just borrow the money, so why not?
Sure. We'll build a pyramid out in Nevada.
Sure, why
just
not?
for the sake of it.
Right.
Why
We'll
not?
turn a whole desert in Southern California into a plantation.
Right.
Good idea.
Right. Question 6. How about the separation of church and state?
What about it?
Is it constitutional?
Well, it depends what you mean by that. If you mean that the federal government isn't supposed to give any aid to religion, then surely that's what the Establishment Clause is about. But if you mean that the federal government is supposed to be interfering in state policy making in regard to religion, no. And here we get back to a point I was making earlier on in the show, that the Constitution only gives a few powers to the federal government. It also has some express prohibitions in the Bill of Rights that are only for the federal government, and the intention was to leave these policies to the states. In fact, the reason for the Establishment Clause was that there were some, the funny wording in the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, was that there were some states at the time that still had state churches, and they wanted to be sure that Congress couldn't make a law that said everybody in America has to be a Lutheran, but it also couldn't make a law that said Massachusetts can't have a policy of requiring you to pay taxes to support congregationalism.
Right.
So, in other words, the federal government was not supposed to establish a religion. It was not supposed to disestablish a religion. It was supposed to stay out of this. Nowadays, usually this term separation of church and state means a federal judge is going to be interfering in state policy making in regard to religion. And that is not what the Constitution says.
Right. 7. Is collective bargaining a fundamental right implied by the 9th Amendment?
No.
No.
There was no such right at the time of the Constitution. Essentially, this kind of behavior was seen as illegal all the way down to the 1930s. We had what were called anti-syndicalism statutes in most of the states, which were intended to prohibit people from unionizing and interfering with business. So, no, there's no fundamental right. And in fact, there's no power in the federal government to be passing laws about unions anyway. That's something that was supposed to be left to the states.
I agree. Question 8, secession from the Union. Is that constitutional?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, again, in my book, James Madison and the Making of America, I show that in the Virginia Ratification Convention, well, back up. Article 7 of the Constitution says it'll go into effect as soon as 9 states have ratified. And the way that they're going to ratify is by each state having within its own borders an election for delegates to a convention whose sole purpose will be to vote yes or no on the Constitution. Now, these were called ratification conventions. In the Virginia Ratification Convention, the last major speech of this 4-week meeting about whether to ratify the Constitution was made by one of the 3 leading Federalist orators, one of the 3 leading pro-Constitution delegates. And what he did was to explain that if Virginia ratified the Constitution, it would be one of 13 parties to a compact, and it would be able to reclaim the powers it was granting to the federal government in case they were abused. Now, they didn't have the word secession, but reclaiming the powers you're granting the federal government was the same thing. And so basically what happened was this guy made this speech, and then they said, all right, call the roll. And the very next thing that happened was they voted yes or no on ratifying the Constitution. So they went into this vote with the understanding that if the Constitution were abused, if the federal government became abusive, then they could pull out of the Union. Which, of course, none of them would have agreed to a new Constitution that didn't allow that, because this is only 5 years after the end of the Revolution. And what was the Revolution about? Well, it was about seceding from the British Empire because Parliament was abusing the states.
Right.
So we're going to create a new Congress to abuse the states and say we can't pull out. It doesn't even make sense.
Right.
But besides this logical question, we have this fine speech from George Nicholas, who later became the first Attorney General of Kentucky, explaining, as I said, that Virginia would be able to secede if it joined the Union.
Right on. Question 9. How about, is the Federal Reserve constitutional?
No.
Okay.
No, actually, the Constitution says states can't print money, and it says the federal government can coin money. It doesn't say the federal government can print money, and it certainly doesn't say the federal government can authorize somebody else to print money on its behalf.
Right.
So, no, there's nothing in the Constitution that empowers the federal government to create the Federal Reserve Bank.
Right on. Question 10. Is pork barrel legislation and earmarks constitutional?
Well, sure. Earmarks just mean
right on.
that just refers to Congress telling the executive exactly how to spend the money that Congress is appropriating. That's what people expected. Now, you use the term pork barrel legislation. Well, unfortunately it's wasteful. Most pork barrel legislation has to do with spending that's not constitutional, like those roads and canals and bridges we were talking about earlier. That's vetoed because there was no power in the Constitution for Congress to be doing that. And as I said before, there has been no amendment since Madison's time making it constitutional for Congress to do this kind of thing. So it's still not constitutional.
Right on. Rocket fire! Yeah! Good job, Professor. Thank you very much. That was fun.
You're welcome.
Here we go. I wanted to save these ones because these are fun. How did the framers of the Constitution define states' rights?
Well, actually, the question is how they defined the federal government's rights.
Right.
So the state governments already existed, and each of them was sovereign. Each of them had authority to do whatever it wanted. And then they gave some few powers to the federal government. There are also a couple of clauses in the federal Constitution that say states can't do this or states can't do that. So there are prohibitions in the federal Constitution, for example, on states passing laws that impair the obligation of contracts. They're not allowed to do that. In other words, they're not allowed to say, this year in Connecticut, nobody has to pay a mortgage payment and there won't be any foreclosures, right? Which is actually, that was the kind of law that states were passing before the Constitution. But besides a couple of prohibitions, states can't print money. That's also in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. But other than that, the Constitution just lists powers of Congress, powers of the federal government, I should say. And if there's not a prohibition on a state doing something in the U.S. Constitution, and if it's not a power that's been given to the federal government exclusively, then the states can still do it, and it's constitutional.
Right. And they had 18 powers, and that was it.
Well, in Article 1, Section 8, although there are a couple of other places in the Constitution where Congress has powers. So, for example, in Article 2, the president is given power to enter into treaties with foreign countries with the advice and consent of the Senate. So the Senate has a power to give its advice and consent on treaties, on presidential nominations of people to executive and judicial posts. There are a couple of other things, but yeah, in general, Article 1, Section 8 lists as 18 powers, right?
Okay, well, speaking of rights, did the 14th Amendment incorporate the Bill of Rights down to the state and local level? Did this grant the Supreme Court the authority to strike down any law it feels it violates the Bill of Rights?
No.
Okay,
no.
So what was the intent? Because that's actually what has happened, though.
Well, right. This gets back to that phenomenon I was talking about at the very beginning of our conversation, where federal judges just kind of make things up and then they enforce them on us. The idea that there's this incorporation feature to the 14th Amendment really was not invented until 5 decades after the 14th Amendment was supposedly ratified.
Okay.
So why wasn't it why is it that federal courts didn't get around to incorporation until 5 decades later? Well, the obvious answer is because nobody thought at the time that was what the 14th Amendment meant.
Right.
And in fact, soon after the 14th Amendment was declared ratified, they had a huge debate in Congress, and this had been something that was brewing in the states for years and years, over passing an amendment that would have made the separation of church and state a constitutional principle enforceable against state governments. That is, people finally were going to have this debate on the question whether the state government should be disallowed to interfere with people's religious practices. Now, one thing that never. Are you familiar with the Sherlock Holmes story, The Hound of the Baskervilles?
Yes. Actually,
Yeah, so
I've watched the old one and the new one from the new Sherlock series. Yes.
Right. So this is the famous story where Sherlock finally figures out what has happened because he says the dog didn't bark, right? So in the case of this question of incorporation, there was this debate right after the 14th Amendment was ratified, and they argued in Congress for weeks and weeks over whether they should pass this amendment that said that the state governments were going to have to respect the principle of separation of church and state, but the dog didn't bark. That is, nobody ever said we don't need this amendment because we already have the incorporation of the First Amendment into the 14th Amendment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody said that.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason nobody said that was it wasn't true.
Right.
So nobody thought of it because it had not happened. There was no incorporation component of the 14th Amendment. So when they were debating having a separation of church and state amendment, nobody said, well, we don't need that because we've already incorporated it into the 14th Amendment. They hadn't incorporated into the 14th Amendment. This is just a made-up argument that's been used by federal judges to empower themselves to veto laws they don't like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nothing more than that. It's, you can dress it up. I mean, you can put lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig, right?
Indeed.
It's still a lie, and it doesn't matter what kind of
lipstick on a
law
pig.
school mumbo-jumbo you want to put on it.
Right.
It's still a lie.
So is social justice compatible with our Constitution? Because this is a term that's been thrown around constantly lately. I want social justice. I'm not treated fairly. Is it compatible? I know this is a stupid question, but this is going out to listeners who are like, whatever. I don't know what they're talking about.
Well, in general, the idea of social justice has something to do with reallocating resources,
Right.
With reapportioning property among people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the issue is, does the Constitution say that the federal government will have power to take money from some people and give it to others just so that those others will have more property?
No.
The answer is no. There's not a Robin Hood clause in the Constitution, right? There's no
robbery clause.
And in fact, the whole idea of taking money from the wealthy and giving it to the poor was something that people who were involved in making the Constitution opposed. I mentioned earlier the obligation of contract. The idea that the federal government, the prohibition in Article 1, Section 10 of state governments passing laws that impair the obligation of contracts. This is called the Contracts Clause.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for the Contracts Clause was that state governments during the Revolution and a few years after the Revolution, before the Philadelphia Convention wrote the Constitution, state governments had been passing laws saying no farm foreclosures this year, or you don't have to pay your rent for the next 6 months in Georgia or New York or wherever. And so they decided, okay, we're not going to have this. We're not going to have legislatures just deciding, okay, there are more poor people than rich people. There are more people who have to pay the rent than there are people who receive the rent. And so we're just going to say you don't have to pay your rent.
Right.
No more of that. That's what the Contracts Clause was about. In those days, they called that kind of a law an agrarian law, right? An agrarian law was one that was going to take money from the rich and give it to the poor.
Okay.
And they were opposed to agrarian laws, and that's one reason for the Contracts Clause. It's also a reason why the states are banned from printing money. Printing money is, of course, a way to screw creditors too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you borrow money from me and then the government prints so much money that the value of a dollar falls by 2/3, right? What used to be a dollar is now only worth 33 cents. Well, basically, if I have to pay you back in money that's only worth 33 cents instead of a dollar, I'm not having to pay you back.
Right.
This is just a way of transferring money from creditors to debtors. And so the prohibition on states printing money was intended to keep states from having these quote unquote social justice laws, right? So the obligation of contracts clause, the ban on states printing money, they're both prohibitions on this social justice kind of stuff, which people at the time thought was immoral. I mean, basically, if you loan me gold and I don't have to pay you back in anything but paper, you're being ripped off.
It's socialism.
You're not getting the benefit of the bargain you made with me. It's as if I were stealing from you, but we're just saying, well, Gutzman didn't steal from you. It was the legislature.
Right.
That makes a big difference. Either way, I'm not paying you back. So they thought that was immoral, and they also thought it would be economically harmful because obviously, if you're a farmer and you have to borrow money every year, the first year you borrow money, and then the legislature says, hey, you don't have to pay it back for 6 months. The second year, you're going to go back to me and you're going to say, well, I need to borrow money this year. I got to put my my crops in. I got to repair my barn. I got to, buy some implements.
Right.
I'm going to say, remember last year you borrowed money and you didn't pay me back? And you say,
Right.
well, yeah, but the legislature said I didn't have to. Well, my answer is going to be, well, okay, go borrow money from the legislature. I'm not going to.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
I didn't get to be the kind of guy who could loan money out by being stupid. So I'm not going to do that. So anyway, the point is these agrarian laws that were addressed by the ban on state governments printing money and by the contract clause, these were seen as immoral and economically harmful. And so that was exactly the kind of legislation that Article 1, Section 10 was supposed to prevent.
One last question, Professor, before we wrap this segment up. How can we shrink the government, and what do we do to go about doing that?
Oh, boy. Well,
if you can answer this in 3 minutes, because we got 3 minutes left.
Well, there are a couple of, obviously you could elect people who would vote to spend less.
Okay.
Actually, there are significant proposals currently being floated to spend less money. In fact, there's a sequestration thing that Congress passed a few years ago and President Obama signed that has led to a decline in spending.
Mm-hmm.
So we've actually had the federal government spending less money the last couple of years, year by year, which Obama, of course, and the Democrats have been howling. This is the worst thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are people running for president like Rand Paul, who's got a budget that proposes flat out eliminating 4 cabinet departments. And he would make serious changes. Actually, I think none of those departments is constitutional and none of them is really helpful. So it's not only Paul, though. People like Walker and Rick Perry and Cruz and several other people are seriously talking about this. I think there's a chance that this kind of thing can happen soon. We all know it's going to happen eventually because
there's no more money.
The federal government has more than $220 trillion in unfunded obligations.
Right.
That is, every year, the American economy is between 16 and 17 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between its anticipated revenue and the anticipated expense of all the promises that the federal government has made is more than 220 trillion.
Right.
So imagine if your total personal debt were 13 times your income, right? There's no way you'd be able to pay that back.
No.
So what would you have to do? Well, you'd have to sell things.
Right.
You'd have to get out from under that debt.
Or live under the radar and be homeless.
Yeah, the federal government is going to have to do that. There's just no way. I mean, there's one of my favorite philosophical sayings is when something can't continue, it won't, right?
Right.
Well, it's impossible for when they created Social Security, it was 16 workers per retiree. By the time I'm retired, it's going to be fewer than 2 workers per retiree. There's no way my 2 kids are going to pay for me to be on vacation for 20 years, right? It's not happening. I want them to anyway. So the bottom line is that this is going to change, and I do think, actually, there are people making serious proposals about getting rid of Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Education, but you can make serious cuts to federal spending. And of course, there's also going to have to be significant change to Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. We need to get rid of Obamacare, the whole thing.
Right on. Totally. Anyways, though, this is Johnny Rocket here at the Johnny Rocket Launchpad. Give it up for Professor Kevin Gutzman.
Man, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for the honor for coming on this show, man. We really appreciate it, sir. Gutzman, you can check him out. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He has books, Virginia's American Revolution. He co-authored Who Killed the Constitution. His new book is James Madison and the Making of America. And my personal favorite, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. Check him out at www.kevingutzman.com. Thank you very much, Professor. This is Johnny Rocket. We're going to be listening to Band of the Week, so stick around and rock and roll.